So hi, everyone. Welcome. I am Joy Nissen. I am the SVP of Leadership Solutions here at AIIR Consulting. Thrilled to be joined by Larry Clark, one of our senior leadership development consultants and a seasoned executive in his own right. Larry has led learning and development strategy at global organizations like Microsoft, Comcast, Harvard Business Publishing. He's also the lead author of the white paper that inspired today's conversation, From Programs to Purpose. So we're gonna talk about all sorts of things today, but I'd love to just start with a little bit of a reality check. So all of us who work in the leadership development or consulting space, we see and hear all the time. People come to us and say, we've invested in great leadership programs, but we still don't have a real strategy. And if that sounds familiar to you, if you're leading in HR, L&D, talent, or if you're coaching those who do, you know what's at stake here. Leadership shapes everything from performance to culture to growth to resilience. And yet, when budget pressures arise, development programs are often the first on the chopping block. So, a little bit of an uncomfortable truth behind that trend is that only 25% of organizations actually believe that their LD efforts actually deliver value. So, that to us is a wake up call. I think it's not enough to offer good programs. To create impact and to protect your investments, you really need something bigger. You need a leadership development strategy that actually connects the dots, one that's aligned and intentional and built to drive outcomes that matter to the business. So that's what today's conversation is all about. And over the next 45 minutes, I'll be guiding a dialogue with Larry to unpack the thinking behind a strong leadership development strategy. So what it is, why most companies don't have one, and how to build one that balances performance, potential, and purpose. We will open things up for a Q&A at the end, but in the meantime, we'd love for all of you who are here with us live to share your questions or reflections in the chat as we go. All right, let's get started. Larry, you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do this.
Okay. So let's kind of start at the beginning. Why do so many leadership development efforts feel busy, but not necessarily effective?
It's a great question. And we hear it all the time. And I've experienced it myself, coming into a role running leadership development and talent management for a global organization where I inherited a whole bunch of stuff and it was kind of like a junk drawer. And there's great stuff in a junk drawer, don't get me wrong. But the thing is, it doesn't all fit together. It's just a bunch of different things that have evolved over time. And I think this graphic kind of tells the picture. I think in earlier times, it was easier to connect the dots between these different things. You could kind of see the picture just by seeing what was in the portfolio of learning assets that an organization or experiences that organizations were using. Today, the noise level in organizations, because of the disruption in the environments that we're in, the amount of change that's going on, the amount of uncertainty, it looks a little bit more like what's on the right. It's harder to tell what the picture is just by looking at what those, if each dot is an asset or learning asset in a larger strategy, it's very difficult to see what the strategy is. And I've noticed that as I worked with organizations who are now saying, we don't have a way to pull this all together. We can't see a picture in what we're doing. Help us create that picture. I'm finding the reason they're asking is it's really challenging to figure out how all of the things that they're doing can fit together. And it's fun when you have that and when you start to unpack it and say, all right, what's underneath all of this? What are we really trying to accomplish? In fact, a lot of times when I'm talking with organizations, when they say they want to talk about a strategy, the first thing they talk about is, well, I need, what platform should we be using right now? Or, what learning modalities? Should I staff or should I buy versus build? Like all those kinds of things. And I say that those decisions, any decision that you make right now on that, it could be good or bad, but they're not based on anything. So we need to take the strategy up a level and start looking at what it is you really are trying to accomplish. And in particular, how you're going to align that back to the business. And then once you have that foundation, then you can make good choices on some of those more operational decisions as in terms of how you implement. But your strategy doesn't live there. It lives upstream from that.
Yeah, I love that phrasing. A lot of times we see that there's a lot of activity and not always a lot of alignment. So really stepping back and trying to get to at least the image of the picture on the left and know where the different dots are, know how the pieces fit before you try to solve for each component part. So I think
Yep.
that's really, really key.
Yep.
So before we kind of dive into some of the minutia here, I'd love to think through with you, Larry, like what is a leadership development strategy? How is it different from just offering great programs?
Well, the when you think about what learning functions and talent functions are responsible for, we need to align to the business. And when you think about what everything, if you think about everything they do, not just leadership development, it focuses on two different things: protect the firm and grow the firm, or strengthen the firm. And the protect the firm is the stuff that we do that's, compliance training or HR policy implementation, those kinds of things. It's really important. It's not real sexy work, but it's really important to the business to do it well. But then if you set those kinds of things aside, pretty much everything else we do is to help strengthen and grow the firm. But when we think about how do we actually go about doing it, it usually falls into one of three different areas, and these three areas all work together. You can see them here on this little kind of Venn on the right: activate performance, accelerate talent, amplify culture. So what a strategy is, it's got to cover these different elements. So what we're trying to do for leadership development is create, as it says here, a systematic and balanced approach to developing the capability and the capacity for leaders to drive results in the business, to meet that near-term relentless rhythm of performance that Wall Street and shareholders and your private equity investor wants. At the same time, you need to be able to future-proof the organization as well. You need to grow. If you're going to try to grow the business by 20%, are you growing leaders by 20% in that time at the appropriate levels in the organization? And are they being grown in the direction, the pace and direction that business is headed? And at the same time, you need to develop leadership capability to enable the organizational culture that's going to be important to drive it forward. So they don't now the three elements don't exist in isolation from each other. They kind of work together. So when you're activating performance, when you do things to activate performance, that naturally will help your talent pipeline over time. But that's a secondary impact. Or when you're doing something around a culture initiative, that's probably going to improve performance as well. I would hope it would. But so everything's going to give you a benefit in other areas, but usually for every learning experience or element of your portfolio, you're targeting one of these three things as you go forward. So that's our working definition. Strategy is about it. How do you equip leaders to drive results, grow leadership at the pace of the business, and enable that desired culture? So, and it all has to work together.
Yeah, no, I think that's such an important point. Like these aren't three separate silos. The development system must address all three together and they have to be in conversation with one another.
Mhm.
So, so say we get all of that. What would you say to someone who's asking, all right, how does this really line up with the business? What are business execs really thinking? How do we actually make this as relevant as we can to the business?
Yeah, it's the important thing to note is that like every executive has two things on their mind. They're worried about that relentless rhythm of performance. How do
Yeah.
we get the business to perform? How do I meet the goals? How do we make sure investors are happy in the near term, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? And they're also trying to future proof. So when talking about how your strategy is helping the business, it's really important to anchor back that we're doing the same thing from a leadership development and a talent perspective. We're activating performance for now, and we're doing the kinds of things that will grow our capability to capability to lead the future organization over time. So one is an immediate play, and the other is a long-term play. And the important thing to note is you can't just do one or the other. Just like an executive can't say, I'm just going to focus on today and forget what happens 3 years from now. And they also can't say, I'm just going to focus on 3 years from now, but the results will come along as they go. Because either situation, they have to manage and balance that tension between the two. And we, as leadership development professionals, have to do the same thing. We have to be worried about both of those and enabling both of those at the same time in a balanced way.
Yeah, especially now more than ever. I mean, the uncertainty of the future is really more pronounced now than I think it ever has been. That's a webinar happening later this month, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think balancing what do we need to do now and what do we need to do for the future is
Yeah.
becoming more and more critical.
Yeah, in fact, when I was at Comcast, I remember meeting with the CHRO, and he said
Mm,
the strategy that we create around leadership development really needs to resonate with the business.
yeah,
So please make sure that it clearly connects. And as I described it in this from this point of view, of it's about investments that we're making for the future of the business, but also improving performance today. It's like I totally get that. I can sell that in the organization. So it's like
yeah,
it clicked for him very quickly.
yeah, yeah. I think business leaders, they're smart, they're practical, they want things that make sense and aren't overly complex or complicated.
Yep.
Okay, awesome. So I know, Larry, you're big on the leadership pipeline model. We use it internally at AIR. You use it in all the work that you do. So can you explain a little bit about like what is this model? How does it help leaders think more strategically about development?
Sure. So in our approach to leadership development strategy, the leadership pipeline model, it would be great actually if everyone could just chat in real quick. What is your how from are you familiar with the leadership pipeline model? Just a yes or a no. If you could just chat in real quick. I just want to see where people are on that. No one's chatting in quite yet. All right. I will assume some knowledge, but not complete knowledge across the organization. So the leadership pipeline model came out back in I think around 2010, something like that, around that time frame. And it was Ram Charan, Steve Trotter, and Jim Knoll that wrote the book called Leadership Pipeline. And what they talked about in the model is that there are up to 7 levels of leadership in any organization. And those seven levels of leadership are as different from each other as like a finance job is from a marketing job, they said. So it's not just a more complex version. All right, Ryan just said, okay, everyone, the chat should work now. Thank you, Ryan. So yeah, I would love to see if the chat's working now, if you could just chat in, how familiar are you with the leadership pipeline model? Yes or no? I've seen it. Yes, yes. Very familiar. Okay, no? All right. So if you're not familiar with it, you'll get an explanation of it. If you are familiar with it, you can see how it ties in to what we're talking about here. So what it says is there are different levels of leadership. They're all very different from each other. And in each level of leadership, there is a turn that people have to make to get through the pipeline. So when we think about how we're preparing leaders to move up this leadership pipeline and to perform wherever they are on the leader, on the whatever level of leadership they're on, then we can see that these two strategies we're talking about great performance today versus grow for the future or prepare for the future, that the pipeline model works great against that because it says for when you're developing to drive performance today, that's where you're looking at people who are in role. So someone who is a first-time supervisor, right? How do we help them? How do we help her become a great first-time supervisor? Or someone who's a functional manager? How do we make that person become great at that particular level? So the drive performance today part of your strategy is really developing capabilities to perform at the current level. Now, at the same time, the other thing that you need to keep in balance with that is how do you get people through the turns? Because in the leadership pipeline model, they say there are big challenges around the turns, and there are also stages of development when you're at level. And they also say the thing you need to do is you need to unclog the pipeline from the bottom up, right?
Mhm.
So a lot of us spend a lot of money and time worried about like high potentials at that, just before executive or executive level, because that's really close to the executives who are paying for all this stuff. But your big opportunity is helping people move up the pipeline at lower levels. You get increased diversity in your pipeline because that's where all the filtering happens. You have just a stronger pipeline in general. You're not just constantly fixing a short-term problem. You're building for the future. So that building future capacity side of your strategy, that's where you're focused on getting people through those turns, the P1 and P2 and P3. How do we help people move from one level to the other? And the thing is, you need to be doing both. So you need to be driving performance today and to be building future capacity. Now, the distinction here is that um, with when you're doing that, you have to keep the two um, in balance with each other, and you can't be over-indexing on just one or just the other to do that. So that's how the leadership pipeline models fits in, and what it gives you then is what referred to as a breadth strategy and a depth strategy. So the breadth strategy is for that drive performance today. So if you've got people who are first-time supervisors again, you can't say like which percentage of what percentage of these should know how to do their jobs. The answer is 100%. You have to target all of them. Like you need to onboard leaders to their role so they understand how to do it. Now, the depth strategy, which is building that future capacity, you're not going to be moving everybody up. There's typically 1 to 4% of your total leadership population that you're going to consider your bench, your high potentials, or something like that, and they're the ones you need to get through those turns in the pipe. So you've got a breadth strategy for 100% of the people at level, and then you've got a depth strategy to get that smaller percentage ready to take on the next level.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we'll dive in a little bit more around the breadth and depth strategy, but just to
We will.
yes, double click on the point that, every leadership level is a fundamentally different job. It's not just a more senior version of the last role. So to succeed at each level, leaders have to shift, what they value, how they spend their time, what they're accountable for. And this really requires a completely different way of working than what they have been accustomed to and what's gotten them to where they are. So, I love the Marshall Goldsmith quote of what got us here won't get us there. And I think that's
That's
really
right.
what we're talking about here.
That's right. The behaviors are really different one level to the next.
Yeah. So let's dive in a little bit more just to give the people a little more insight into how do these two strategies work in practice, the breadth versus the depth.
Yeah, so this is really the heart of getting a strategy together for leadership development. On your drive performance today is your breadth strategy, and the building future capacity is your depth strategy, as I mentioned. And you can see here how that actually plays itself out from business focus, audience development goals, approach, measures. So on the business focus for your breadth strategy, you've got high performing work teams and business results. Like that's what you're trying to accomplish. And you measure it, as it says on the bottom, by business performance and also employee and team engagement. Are teams being effective? Are they getting things done? Are you hitting the numbers that you need? Now, as I said, the audience for that, all leaders at the current level, because it's broad based. Everybody's got to be successful in their jobs. You got to give them the chance to do so. And then your development goals, you're accelerating time to readiness. So the onboarding period for a leader at a new level, whether it's first time supervisor or first time executive, you need to compress the amount of time that it takes for them to get ready, and also make sure that it's as clean as possible, because new leaders at a new level, it can be a mess. It can go sideways very easily. So what support are you giving them to make sure that that doesn't happen? And also just maximizing their performance and their results. The approaches are the traditional approaches that we all are familiar with: skills training, tools and resources to support performance. Also, much more present is information and connection on demand. Got a tough meeting. I got to give somebody feedback at 2 o'clock this afternoon. Is there a tool that can help me prepare for this meeting? So, and then, as I said, measures business performance, employee and team engagement. Let's see. I'm just looking to a question. Do most people tackle depth with their executive training programs and succession planning? Yeah, let's get into that, Gregory. So let's move to the depth strategy here. So creating your focus on that is not about just driving. It's not about driving results, because remember, this is a long-term play in building future capacity. So you're creating bench strength and developing ready now successors. And if you jump down to the bottom of that column, you're measuring it using talent metrics. I published a blog post with Harvard Business School Publishing around talent metrics are business metrics. So on this side of the game, you're talking about leadership talent pipeline health. What's your internal fill rates? How are your talent pools around? Do you have people that are ready now successors? And also you want to see your promotion, your retention of high potentials, because one of the things that you're trying to do in your depth strategy is you're trying to re-recruit people. You're betting the farm on them. They're your top people. You want to make sure that they want to stay, that they feel special. And again, it's selected high potentials, typically 1 to 4% of leaders at any particular level. And what your development goals are a little bit different. You're assessing, there's a lot of assessment that goes on with high potential programs. And you're assessing to build next level capabilities. How are they going to do at the next level, not in the job they're in right now? And also expand their perspective. So when they get through that turn, they know what's coming. And the approach is a little bit different. It's typically immersive learning to shift the mindset, cross-functional project work. So you're throwing them in different environments to stretch their thinking and change their mindset, and a lot of executive exposure and re-recruitment. So these are the two basic strategies, and it's what people who have a good strategy will have a balance between these two, and they're very intentional about each one and how they go about it. Their investments are balanced, and their approaches are balanced between these two.
What percent of companies would you say, Larry, have the balance right?
It's a really small percentage.
Mm.
Um, but I would say it's a small percentage of organizations that I've come across that actually have a strategy in the first place.
Yeah.
They may have a holistic strategy, I should say. Most organizations have a strategy for one piece or the other. They may say, like, we're really invested in our high potentials. And then others, you would say, they're very much invested in like onboarding and things like that. They have a big machine around that. But very few organizations have the balance right, I think, between both because it's
Yeah.
expensive, right? You got to make trade-off choices because you can't do everything. So you need to pick which one you're going to focus on, but you need to have a balance in the choices that you make.
Yeah. I think that's where we see a lot of kind of the swirl or spiral happen internally is when companies are out of balance and they maybe don't realize it. So having this structure and this intentionality and way of grounding kind of development efforts helps companies scale and focus their investments and actually balance both sides of the house.
Yeah, yeah. And just to build off of, just to answer more thoroughly Gregory's question about,
Mhm.
do most people tackle depth with their executive training programs and succession planning? I'd say yes, but I think what they're missing, Gregory, in that is they're not doing as much um, in high potential development of lower levels of leadership. Um, One firm I worked with, they put together a process for um, a high potential program for for people moving into first level leadership because they were bringing in a lot of people in from the outside, which was expensive. And they
Mhm.
also were finding from a diversity perspective that they weren't getting the same level of diversity they had in their broader pool of people who are individual contributors. So we had worked with them to put together a high potential program, and these people got snapped up like crazy. And I remember the CHRO of that organization was saying, like, what did what's the secret sauce of this program? Why is it working so well? And I said, I wish I could say it was because we built a great program, but what we actually did was we created a selection process that identified people who are high potential at that level, which the organization didn't have visibility to. So um, I would say that a lot of organizations do, to answer Gregory's question, they do target higher levels for that in executive training programs for some of that. Where they're missing it a lot of times is at those lower levels, where there's huge opportunity to bring high potential leaders up in the pipeline, earlier in the pipeline.
Yeah, no, that's great. We have a couple questions in the chat. We were going to save all Q&As till the end, but these are so topical and relevant. I think we just
Okay,
hit
let's
some
do
of
it.
them now. So can you say a little bit more, Larry, about what re-recruitment looks like?
A lot of times it's simply, a lot of times it's simply executive exposure,
Mhm.
presenting to executives, being mentored by executives, being having executive advocates in the business. So there's that. There's also explicitly telling people you are a high potential. Like a lot of organizations are saying, should we tell people that they're high potential? It's like, oh my gosh, yes. You're telling them they're special. You're telling them that you're betting, you're
Right.
investing in them, you're betting on them. Yeah, yes, you want to keep them here. And it's letting them know, look, we consider you high value talent in the organization. We are letting you cut in line in front of other people on things like promotions because we think you have the headroom to take that stuff on. So it's letting them know they're standing in the organization as high potentials and giving them connections and helping them build their network across the organization. That's a lot of what re-recruitment looks like.
Yeah.
And I'm sure
Yeah.
people in the chat could put a whole bunch of other things that they're doing already today in the area of recruitment.
Yeah. No one will be upset to hear that they're special though.
Yeah. And then Gregory had another question. If
Yep.
you're doing all the parts, they're not connected. How do you bring it all together? We're going to get to that question
Yep.
as we get into. And then Jeff, you had a question. What role does executive coaching play? Executive coaching, when we're talking about solutions and initiatives around this, we don't separate coaching and what we consider more structured learning or some of these other elements. We consider and assessments. We consider them all tools that we would use together for that. So leadership coaching for people who are not executives and executive coaching for those are definitely a part. And at the executive level, executive coaching gets used in both strategies. Drive performance today. For executives, you may have seasoned executives that have topped out. They're not going to, they're in their destination role, but they're doing great at it. They don't want to become C-suite members. They're doing great at what they're doing, but they can use coaching to support what it is that they do, or coaching in alongside other development experiences they have them going through. And we have a number of organizations that we're working with now that we incorporate executive or leadership coaching along with structured learning, along with assessments to create kind of a holistic development path for them.
Yeah, and we have great data too that I know you helped gather, Larry, through Harvard around just the combination of different interventions. So the learning with the coaching coupled with assessment, all of it together yields much better ROI than just one of them individually. So we're big believers in the integration of solutions and in the integration of interventions.
Yep, absolutely. Excuse me.
Okay, so let's say we understand the different leadership levels and the transition points between them. How do we actually define success at each level? Maybe talk through the differences in capabilities, values, time application, and like behavioral anchors that leaders need at each level.
Sure. Yeah, there's one of the things that you need if you're saying we're trying to develop our leaders is develop them to be what?
Mhm.
Like what does great look like for leadership for our organization? So, people talk about competency models and capability frameworks and all those kinds of things. They're all essentially a similar thing. It's a set of behavioral anchors is what great looks like. And I think what's important about that is, first of all, that it's complete, that it covers what it is. It's done in the language that resonates with the organization's culture,
Mhm.
and that it's tiered, meaning the behaviors, like one organization we worked with they used, instead of the term strategic thinking, they used the term forward thinking. And they did that because they said, the behavior at an executive level is really what most people would call strategic thinking. It's you're thinking about a portfolio of investments you're making over 3 to 5 years. But if you're a first level supervisor, it's look before you leap. Like think ahead in terms of what you're doing and connect what you're doing to the bigger picture. So they called it forward thinking, but they specified the behaviors very differently for each level. And sometimes they were the same around things like feedback and coaching. Other times, like driving change or strategic leadership, the behaviors are very different at the different levels. So what that helps with is it helps describe, as you make turns in the pipeline, what are the new expectations? You're managing managers. So the new expectation isn't so much about driving work of your team, it's working horizontally. That becomes a much bigger, and developing leaders, first level leaders. So the behaviors will shift over time. So what you're seeing here is the LD12 or Leadership Dimensions 12 leadership framework that we use at AIR, and it's in three basic domains: leading self, leading others, and leading the organization. And each of the three areas has four different subdomains, like in leading self, self-management, time and energy, decision-making, and leadership brand. And then beneath each of those, so there's 12 total across all three. And then beneath each of those, you can see listed these 45, what we call skill areas that define what great looks like in leadership. This is we have assessments based on this. They're behavioral assessments that we do, as opposed to like a personality assessment, like a Hogan or MBTI or something like that. But we can assess against this, either individual assessment or 360 assessment, but helping dig into how does this person showing up? What is it they're actually doing? And where do their strengths lie in terms of their behavior? And where are some gaps that they could fill to get better? But this is a very complete picture, and we've used this. A number of organizations have taken this directly. Many organizations kind of rebrand. They take this and they change the language around it so it resonates in their organization, which is strongly recommended. So it looks like them, but the underlying the bones of it are the same.
Yeah, I think people really respond to just clarity around what's expected at each level. So when you can
Mhm.
give those behavioral anchors to folks, they really get a sense of, okay, where are my strengths, where are my gaps? And if there's support and training around those areas of opportunity, they're set up to succeed.
Yeah, and for the learning organization, this gets used not just in developing learning solutions, or but it also gets used in recruiting. Like, what are we
Hmm.
looking for with
Hmm.
people? It gets used in succession planning. Are they ready to start behaving this way? Do they have what they need for that?
Yeah, it takes a lot of the potential bias out of the equation
It
as well
does.
because you have something a little more systematic
Yeah.
to anchor to.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So as Larry said, this is just one of the frameworks. There are many others, and the important thing is to just have one. Okay. So I think this touches on one of the earlier questions and earlier points, but when in a leader's journey do you feel development efforts matter most? When does it move the needle most?
Yeah. So this is one of the things also that comes from the leadership pipeline, that there are developmental points or intervention points in someone's development where they need some kind of structured support from a learning perspective. One is when they start a new job. So um, their head is spinning. They've got a lot to take on. They've probably usually got a new team that they've got to ramp up with and all that. So that's a really important, that's probably of all three of these, that's probably the single most important intervention point. When somebody starts a new gig, they need some kind of structured learning support to help them understand what it is that they need to do and ramp up as quickly as possible. The next is when they've gotten to the place where they've got the basics down. Like, they understand how to do the job, they've found their footing, they have their sea legs, but they need to go from good to great. They've kind of plateaued. And how do I make this job my own? How do I leverage my own unique strengths in this role to be really, really good at this? And that's the progression stage. For a first level supervisor, it could be a year, it could be 18 months. For someone in a more senior position, it could be 2, 3, 4 years before they're ready for that, because it takes longer as you take on more responsibility. And then the final one is transition. This is when, okay, I've done all that. Now I'm exploring what's next for me, and how do I start preparing my mind and get in the right mindset to actually move into that next level. So we talked about breadth and depth. Those first 2 points, onboarding progression, are development in role. So we would call those breadth solutions, and those need to be available to everyone. Transition is your depth solution that's targeting that. And then underneath, you can see continuous learning. What are the tools, the reinforcement, the sustainment, on the job support that you provide to people so they can be good leaders in the moment? So these are the times that I always think about, like, what have you done? What are you doing at each of these intervention points for your leaders at each level to understand, to help them move through that leadership pipeline and be really, really great at their job? I'm looking over at the chat.
Yeah.
There's
We have
all
a
kinds of
chat
stuff going on.
question.
I love that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So Alec asked, one of the practical challenges we face with the transition intervention point is that we simply can't promote everyone who's ready, and
Yep,
promotions can't be guaranteed, even those for those on a succession path. So how
absolutely.
do you see organizations balance that, and what strategies do you use to help ensure that development remains meaningful and motivating?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that I find actually is that organizations don't always, they're usually not developing enough people to fill their pipeline.
Okay.
And the way that I do it is I use talent metrics to do that. So, like, what is your annual, and we'll talk about this in a second, but I look at each level of leadership and I say, what's your annual turnover and what's your internal promotion rate or your internal fill rate? So how many people leave this job every year? This level of leadership every year, and how many times you have to go outside to fill those openings. And that usually tells the story. So, like one organization that we worked with, they had almost 30% turnover of their first level supervisors. They were in retail and first level supervisors, and 50% of the time they were going outside to fill that job. And with the number of people, it's like, wow, that's like 400 people a year that are new to role in that. Like there's a challenge with that. So a lot of times, Alec, what we see is that people are not doing enough based on their talent pipeline metrics. But that said, so if you're aligned really, really well with the talent management system, there can be more places for those folks to go. However, there are organizations that are they're not in a growth mode, and they don't have high turnover that may end up in a situation like you're mentioning. You're gonna typically in a situation like that, you're probably gonna lose some of your high potentials in that, and that's just the benefit that you're casting into the sea of leadership capability around the world. But you can't not develop, you know? So as long as you're continuing to invest in those people, you know that you have enough people to grow the business as the business picks up on growth. So that's how I've seen organizations just say, you know what, we need to invest because even we want to hang on to these people. So even if we don't have a place for them and we're not guaranteeing them a promotion, we need to tell them we're investing in you. So when these opportunities do arise, you're first in line for those. And that usually is a huge step forward from what they were already doing.
Yeah, yeah. Another question from the chat. Amy asked, for a new talent management team, do you recommend putting energy into breadth or depth strategies to gain credibility as a new function?
Yes. Terrible answer, Larry. So, yeah, I tell people that if they can fill every box for breadth and depth and every intervention point, they probably have too much money. You need to prioritize. What I've also seen though, and then we're getting into this here. So this is maybe it will describe this to help answer. Um,
Yeah, the questions were naturally leading
yeah,
to our
yeah.
final
Just so I don't
slide
know if you
here.
wanted to set this up at all,
Yeah,
Joy.
no, sure. So, this is one of my favorite tools, one that we use with clients all the time. It's a, simple but powerful way to step back and ask, is our leadership development system doing what it's meant to do? So, yeah, Larry, I'll let you talk us through how this tool works in practice, maybe share an example of how you've used it with a client to drive better decisions around development
Yeah,
investment.
so there's a lot on this table here.
Yeah.
Um, So the exercise we like to take talent and learning leaders through, is first of all list your leader levels on the left. What do you call them? What are they? This is an example from one client. How many leaders do you have at each level? So this is an organization that you can kind of tell the size of it. We have other organizations that may have 10, 15,000 leaders spread across different levels. And so we ask them, I actually, on this form, I'll have them put not just number of people, but what is the turnover rate? What's the internal fill rate or internal promotion rate? So we can get a snapshot. And the succession health is really, in some ways, it's somewhat subjective, but somewhat objective. When it comes time to promote people, do we have the talent we need to fill these open positions? So in this example, succession health was yellow for the executives, definitely red for the operational leaders. So you can see where that comes out. And then we put the intervention points, onboarding, progression, transition. What are you doing for those from the looking at it through the lens of assessment, coaching, structured learning interventions. So we list out here. So what I typically recommend, Amy, is fill this out for your own organization, and say, like, what are we doing for each of these intervention points? And then also look at the other assets that don't fall anywhere on here. Like, where are the learning interventions? Like, oh, we've got this culture initiative that's really popular. Or we did this thing on emotional intelligence, or we have the coaching skills program that cuts across roles. Like, what are you doing outside of this as well? instead of investing in these specific intervention points, or how could those things fit into that. But what I typically say, I was working with a bank in, I think it was in Hong Kong, um, and they had a similar question for me, Amy, about like, we have all this stuff we could be working on. Where do I start? And I said, what are you doing to onboard your frontline managers? And she said, we don't have anything. And I said, that's the hot spot. If you're not doing that, then your whole pipeline and the performance of your organization is at risk. You have to onboard your new leaders effectively. First of all, because they've never been leaders before, and or if they have, they haven't done it here. And it's the largest population of leaders. They lead the most people in the organization. And if that's not working, your performance is going to be a mess. So I typically say start there. If onboarding isn't healthy at any level, I usually say that's probably one of the most important things, because you can't really know who's high potential if you haven't even trained people to do their jobs, because their performance is going to suffer. So it's that kinds of is a feeder for everything. I hope that's helpful, Amy, answering your question.
Amy said great tool, so I
Okay.
think she's sold.
Awesome.
But yeah, I mean, I
Wonderful.
think I think the title of this tool is intentional. It really is a portfolio health assessment. We're really using this as a way to regularly check in with our programs, with our organization's programs, and see, where are the biggest gaps and strengths? Are we over investing anywhere? How balanced is our investment across breadth and depth strategies?
Mhm.
Is there a clear purpose of each program? What additional data do we need? What are we missing to make smart decisions?
Right.
Given our business goals and pipeline needs and health, where are the biggest opportunities? So having this as a regular, assessment that you use internally can be really, really helpful and help avoid that kind of junk drawer of legacy problems that you mentioned at the top of the hour, Larry.
Yeah. 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 It's typically enlightening to go through the exercise, because there isn't there hasn't been in our industry or in our profession a prescribed model for leadership development strategy. And that's why we created this, because it's got to align to the business well, and you've got to have a reason for everything that you're doing. And you got to know that, the levers that you got to know what levers you're trying to pull and how you're trying to pull them. And then once you have something like this, then you can start looking at what platforms, what content, which vendors we use, buy versus build, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, and we didn't show this here, but we typically will use the portfolio health assessment to then tie into what is your pipeline of programs? What do you want to tackle, or what do you need to tackle year one, year two, year three? And you have
Mhm.
kind of a systematic roadmap in place, as opposed to kind of ad hoc programs that kind of spring up, or
Yeah.
a lot of times I think the talent management team is responsive or reactive to what the
Yeah.
business is asking instead of proactive. So this really helps take the reins back a little bit.
Yeah. And it helps if you're a learning organization that works separate from the talent management organization. It doesn't just help with connecting to the business leaders because they'll get this, but it also helps connecting to talent management because, when I started at Comcast, I had been doing leadership development a long time, but I had never owned both talent management and all
Mhm.
succession planning for the organization as well as leadership development. And it's like, wow, I'm getting an education. Like there's a whole area around leadership development that I was just completely missing on
Mhm.
that. So yeah, you get a much broader perspective and you're able to connect it back. The other thing that I see that I see with organizations is the first time they see this, they just want to fill every box.
Yeah.
Um, but you don't just build these programs, you got to implement them. You may have thousands of leaders that need to go through all these different experiences. You want to take your time and make your first choice as well. Do a balance of some breadth and some depth in key spots, measure measure the impact, and then build off of that as you implement over time. What I've seen, for example, that organizations don't often understand is like, we finally got our supervisor onboarding in place. But now the rest of the business is saying, we have all these other supervisors that never went through anything like this. So we need them to go through it too. It's like, okay, we'll build the essentials program. We're not going to call it onboarding, but it's essentially the same thing for all the other supervisors that never had the advantage of doing this. So it's like you need to anticipate as you're getting into it and starting to roll these things out, how the workload spreads over time and how you're going to manage that as you implement.
Yeah, getting everyone kind of up to speed with what you're rolling out. It is funny when you show this table to companies for the first time and they get so excited around the opportunities and the possibility and like you said, Larry, wanting to fill every box and having every box say year one, to
Yeah,
kind of pause and be like, well, implementation is a pretty
yeah,
heavy load, and
it will crush you.
what do you internally and
Yeah,
even with partners have the capacity to take on. So really being strategic around what is critical, what do you want to tackle first, and what can, even though it's important, wait maybe a
yeah.
year or two to roll out, to be realistic.
Yeah, it's also too important because a lot of organizations are running a lot of topical programs.
Yeah.
Like I said, this is our coaching program. This is our emotional intelligence program. This is our leading change program. And what we typically recommend is that you don't put topical names on anything
Mhm.
because the business is going to change. It's going to evolve. You're going to be building cultural elements into it. You're going to be building, you want this. It's better to say this is, supervisor fast track or something, some generic kind of term that you can rewire what's under the hood as you go and you improve it. And those things like coaching skills migrate into it. Those things like your broad cultural initiatives get embedded in it over time. And it just becomes, it's focused on the learner and it's focused on the intervention point, where you are in your career right now and the job that you're doing right now. So we're getting you ready for that. All the things that you need to be ready for that. We got another. Kim likes the term junk drawer. Okay. Lots of valuable stuff. I love my junk drawer, right? It's
It's,
hard to
it's
find stuff and it's not very organized, but I love my junk drawer.
I have two junk drawers at home, so.
We do too. We do too. Yeah. Over when my
Um,
wife said we're going to do a second junk drawer, I'm like, really? Do we have to do that? So apparently there are different kinds of junk.
Okay, so we are at the Q&A portion, which is great because we have a couple new questions flowing in. So, thank you, Larry. We'll keep the party going, but for all of
Sure.
you in the chat, feel free to start typing in or start sharing, what questions you're still wrestling with, what are the dots you're still trying to connect.
So my question was, a lot of managers don't want to take on higher roles because they come with very little incentive to take on the role,
Hmm.
and it's easier to just stay in the current role, because the salary compensation is just so small that they don't want to take the next role. So obviously paying them more would be one solution, but companies often don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, that is ultimately if the compensation isn't competitive, then you'll probably end up losing them over time. Sometimes development is a good way to hang on to people, but yeah, if they don't want to go, if they don't want to move, developing them for something that they're not going to be doing, it may be a waste. But I would say that's a larger talent management and also compensation question. I don't know, Joy, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there, Larry. You don't, people want to be willing. You want people to be excited to be developed and to see the trajectory. And that has to be a push-pull. Leaders have to lean into the development, and
Yeah.
organizations also have to paint a compelling picture of why this development is important.
Hi, I don't have to be unmuted. My question, I think, is
Is
fairly clear.
self-explanatory?
I was poking around in your brain, Larry, or hoping to poke around in your brain and thinking, what's kind of rolling around in your head right now that you haven't published yet, and it's not quite out there, but you've got some sort of interesting, cutting edge ideas that you might want to explore with this group, or like
Yeah.
heads up, this is coming out, and I'm changing this model up. I'm going to move this over here. Anything you'd be willing to share?
I think the big topic, it's a great question, Amy. There's a lot that's kicking around in my head. As Joy knows, it's a kind of a carnival in there. But the one thing that I'm hearing a lot about, there are two things I would say that I'm hearing a lot about. One is pretty interesting. The other is kind of mundane but important. The one that I'm gravitating to a lot is just we need to double down on leading through uncertainty and helping people thrive in very uncertain environments, which kind of fights how organizations are built. Organizations are built around the premise that we can be certain, like we can plan, we can forecast, and we know how the year is going to end up. And if we don't get there, then somebody screwed up. And really, it's not like that anymore. And I think we've known it for a long time, but we got our first dose of it with COVID. I remember talking to one chief revenue officer of an organization. He said, for the first time in my life, I have no idea how to forecast. Like I have no basis or no heuristics that I can use to predict where we're going to end up at the end of the year. We could be in very different places. So how do you lead through uncertainty? And a lot of it is about embracing this concept of emergence and experimentation, that you have a North Star, but you're opportunistic in getting yourself there. It's a really different muscle, and it kind of fights the way we've been taught to lead. So that's one of the things that's coming up. The other thing, which is more mundane, but I'm seeing it's like a big issue right now, is for more senior leaders being able to coach for accountability, where how you delegate and coach leaders is different than how you do it for individual contributors. Some of the basic principles are the same, but how you have to actually go about doing it and holding them accountable throughout that process and encouraging them developing through it, that's coming up all over the place in working with leaders who are like, I just don't know how to keep the reins on everything that's going on my team, and people are not being consistent in delivering what I'm expecting. So those are a couple of things I've started to do some more writing about, and we'll probably be coming out with some more stuff around those topics, but hope that's helpful.
Thanks for your comments, Larry. I really appreciate it. My
Oh, sure.
question is, how do you think about when to build a program, across your matrix there versus bringing something that's more an off-the-shelf program that might help you get up to speed more quickly?
Um, I've always made that decision based on what I'm trying to do. Like, if an off-the-shelf program is going to meet the objectives and I can implement more quickly, then I go for it. Because it takes, as long as it's something that can be tailored enough that it feels like our own organization will embrace it. As long as acceptance can be high, that's where I think when you get into more complex needs, then sometimes it requires more customization when learning objectives are complex. The other thing is, in this approach that I'm talking about, you're typically integrating multiple topics across learning journeys. So if you are buying off the shelf, it needs to be something that can, modality-wise, can fit into that type of, like, how it needs to be built into a larger program, because topics are generally offered by vendors based on their expertise. Like, they're really strong at, they have a great delegation model, or they're really strong at something else. So I buy where possible. And then if I can't find something that I can buy, I will build from there. That's typically how I do it. It's a good question, Jeff.
We've got a question from Melissa Frank. Can you give an example of the difference in holding leaders accountable versus others? You give me an aha moment, but I need a little bit of help with it.
Yeah, it's when you delegate to another leader, they're going to be delegating that work through to their team typically, or enlisting a team, or working across a group of people. When you're delegating to an individual, it's usually much tighter what you're doing. So the process of delegation is different. It's a conversation, as opposed to, I'd like you to do this, and here's the budget you have for it. It's more you're developing the plan together. And that makes it a little looser in terms of how you do it. And the coaching for accountability, the problems that leaders have in implementing are typically much more cross-functional in nature, much less tangible. So leaders need to be much more intentional about how they coach, and they need better skills to have a dialogue with someone who's, they may be a leader of individuals, they may be a leader of leaders, and they're running this project that's got all kinds of cross-functional mess associated with it and fights against the grain of the culture of the organization or whatever. So it requires more. It requires more effort. It requires more being present, understanding, asking more questions, as opposed to telling people what to do. but still giving your expertise where it's needed. So, so yeah, those are some of the differences. And what I'm finding is, like in my executive coaching discussions, I'm just finding they're seeing that it's really hard. It's like, first, take a step and go back to basics as to how this is supposed to work, and then let's apply it to your situation and some of the complexity that you're dealing with in the kinds of assignments you're giving to your people. So I hope that's helpful.
Larry, Jamie had a question on what suggestions do you have for measuring impact? So
Oh, I love
we
the
get a
measurement
lot.
question. I love talking about measurement. I am a big believer in measuring. So it depends. For your breadth strategy, it's be bold. Like try to tie it to a business metric. So if you're working with supervisors who are running call centers, look at call center metrics. Say, of the people who have participated in this learning, what do their call center metrics look like before and after? Use control groups, like do it right. The main thing I tell people is don't measure everything. Pick one or two spots, because most learning organizations don't really know how to do measurement effectively. So you want to. I worked under a very good chief talent development officer who was all about data, and she made every person in our group do two measurement studies every year. And it was mostly about just building the muscle and changing your thinking about how you're doing it. So, and then if you're doing talent programs, I look at talent metrics. Are people moving up? Is our pipeline getting healthier? Our succession rates more? Our talent pools or our short lists of people for a particular job more diverse than they were before? Like, look at those what's our high potential retention, and what trajectory is it on? Is it going up? Is it differ by levels? Like I use talent metrics on the depth side. I use business metrics, and I also use engagement metrics. Like, are people, we do these engagement surveys, let's use them. How are people feeling about, not about their leader necessarily, but about the organization? Do they feel like they get to do their best work every day? Those kinds of things. Those also are helpful metrics for measuring your breadth strategy. So that's usually how I approach it. And I usually say, start small, do one in each area, and build that muscle, because those projects, to do them well, take time.
Awesome. I know we have a few more questions that I don't think we'll get to because we are just about at time, but huge thank you to you, Larry, for letting us inside the carnival of your mind for the last hour, and to all of you for joining us today. These conversations, I think, really matter more now more than ever, because leadership development isn't just about growth. It's really about effective performance and alignment and resilience, especially in this day and age. So we're happy to chat more if you're wondering about what this could look like in your organization or with the clients you work with. We're around. We'll be sending a recording of today's session to everyone who registered. So if you're watching live, you can watch again. If you're watching on a recording, hello. And we hope
we're recording this.
So we really hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation. Once this webinar wraps, you'll be redirected to the white paper landing page. So feel free to download the white paper that sparked this whole conversation if you haven't yet already. It's also in the confirmation email for this webinar. So really just a crystallized version of everything we've talked through today in writing form.
Yes.
But
Thanks for joining, everybody.
Great. Yeah, thank you guys. Really great conversation. One of my favorite topics with one of my favorite colleagues.
Back at you.
Thank you guys.